some work to the 32 today. We've had a bit of an issue with the caster brackets flexing because they don't have any bracing or anything on it. So what we're going to do is we're going to get some steel, some flat plate. I'm going to weld that on through here to strengthen that up, and then we'll do a Nismo power brace, not from Nismo, from us, and it's going to go across here to strengthen that up as well. And then while we're at it, we're going to lengthen the control arms, which will give us a bit more clearance and a bit more camber, because the 32 has very minimal camber adjustment. So we're going to get that out, get a bit more track, a bit more clearance for when down the track we get a bit more lock. So this is the plate we're going to use, some 75 by 5. Cut that up, chuck that underneath, and then we've got the scrap pile over here. We'll find something else for our Nismo power brace. So we've got the caster rod brackets here, and we've got some steel plate here, which is 75 by 3. We've just cut it to length. You want to leave a little bit of room up here so you can still get the actual caster rod in. So brought it back here, clean this up, and then left a little bit of room here if we ever need to get in here for whatever. You got to obviously get to these bolts, and that's for your radiator. So I think that sticks out a little bit, so you don't want to cover that up so it doesn't fit in there. So we're going to tack these up, weld them up, put them back into the car, and then we're going to mock up a bar between them. So that'll strengthen it up a bit, and then we're going to get to doing the lower control arms as well afterwards. So let's get to it. So we got our control arms all cut, our bit that we're going to weld in to extend them cut, and the brace for underneath. So this is the way I do it. Everyone does it differently, but I've crashed a lot of times and I know how to make my control arms bend nicely. So basically you want to, this is a very important part, you want to cut it after the caster arm mount, because if you cut it here or anywhere here, it'll stuff up where your caster arm bolts. So you want that to stay, that position to stay where it is, and then cut it here. I normally go about 25mm past this, that way I've got enough room to get this nut back in after. These are just standard 32 control arms. If you got 33 or S14, S15, 34, they're normally about 10mm longer than these. So these ones are extending 30mm, which is not too aggressive, it's pretty mild. But if you had 33 ones or whatever, you'd probably only go 25mm or so. Any more than that and you're going to have a massive amount of camber. So basically we're going to put this bit in here, and then we're going to weld that bit to there, and then we've got this bit cut on an angle, obviously that'll go underneath to brace it, and on that angle of where the caster sort of bolts up as well. And what I do is I only brace the bit that I weld. I don't brace this bit, because if it happen to have a crash or whatever, you want this to bend. You don't want to be having this nice and strong and then bending things down the line, your cross member or your chassis rail or whatnot. So every time I've crashed, which is a lot of times, it's always bent here, and it saved my cross member and my chassis rail. So that's the reason why I only brace that bit there, whereas other people brace the whole lot. And then when you have a crash, you bend something else that's more expensive to replace, whereas these are really cheap and easy. So that's my reasoning for that. So I'm going to tack it all up together and then, yeah, get it welded up Meanwhile, we've got the caster arm brackets in the car, so I've basically just welded them up. I didn't weld it the whole way, it doesn't need it the whole way, it just needs a few bits to hold it there. Then we've bolted it back up, and we're going to get the bar, and we're going to cut that. And we're going to install it basically where these little bolt holes are, through there, straight across. So that way, whenever there's any force on one of them, say there's force on this one, it's going to share the load with that one there, which is going to make them stronger together. Whereas before, when it wasn't braced there, these have a lot of flex when you're either on full lock or under braking. The little sheet metal there starts to flex around, and then you've got a lot of movement there. So we're just strengthening that up. Alright, here's the finished product. Might need to install a lock stop as well, we'll see once we put it all together. But there's your obviously normal control arm, and there's your square tube in there, welded in, 30mm. And then just weld it all the way around. Get a bit of flat bar there to brace it, enough room to get the caster arm bracket in as well, the nuts there. And then just a quick spray with fiddly bits, and she's ready to go in. So when she bends, if it crashes, or when it crashes, it's going to bend up here, rather than some people put a brace all the way along there and then it doesn't bend. So yeah, let's chuck her in.
You had to say when, or?
Also, when you extend the control arms, you need to get longer tie rods and tie rod ends. I'll give you the part numbers so it's easier for you. So these, I believe, are N14 tie rod ends, and the part number is TE-926. And then these tie rods are A31 Maxima, I think they are.
A33.
A33 Maxima. Some kind of Maxima, but the part number is RE1050. So these are about 25 bucks each. We get them from Car Parts Plus in Lonsdale. You can get them from plenty other places. Some of the brand name places will sell them as well, but they'll charge you 40-50 bucks each when they're just reselling the same things. So yeah, you can get them from your local parts shop. Just quote those part numbers: TE-926 and RE1050. So we're back again for another day of working on the 32. I'm not sure exactly where we got up to filming on the last day, but I'll try and catch you up here. So we got the extended lower control arms in. We've braced up the caster arm brackets and put the non-Nismo power brace in, so that's all nice and strong now. And then we've put the Maxima tie rods in and the N14, I think it was, tie rod ends in, but with the standard knuckles they're a little bit too long, and this wheel is basically pointing straight, and this one is almost on full lock. We have run out of adjustment on this one. That's actually maxed out in there. We could cut this down, get a little bit more, but this one has only got a little bit left in it, so we've sort of given up for now. And what we're going to do is we could remove one of these rack spaces, because that extends it out as well. This one is only a little bit of actual extra rack movement, so it's not really needed. You can just put the slip on in if you really need, to try and make it a little bit shorter. Or obviously we can cut them down, but the next option I've got is I found these knuckles that I had. They're Costal bolt-on knuckles, which are actually prototype ones from a fair few years ago, which I had on my S13. I tested out. And what I'm going to do is I've got these 33 knuckles out the back. I'm going to see if we can make them fit onto here. So these knuckles are actually adjustable Ackerman, and they correct roll center at the same time. It will give us a little bit more camber by bumping out the pickup point there. And they also have bump steer correction, lowering the pickup point there. So I'm going to try and see if we can fit them to these knuckles, but I think what I'm going to have to do is, it sits about there, and this bit here is in the way. So I'm going to try and cut that off and then see if they'll still fit. I'm not actually sure if they're universal between S and R chassis, but there's only one way to find out. So we got the knuckles to fit up. What we ended up doing was cutting off the lock stop off of the standard knuckle, which made enough clearance for these to fit in. Then these bolt up to the knuckle. Your control arm bolts to the bottom part of this, and then your Ackerman adjustment is up here, which bolts to the bracket which the brake caliper bolts to. And you've got 3 adjustments in here, 1, 2, 3, and that one adjusts basically where this point sits in correlation to the hub. So we put it all together, had it all done up loose, and then we had it max all the way in as far as we could go, and both wheels are pretty much pointing dead straight, which is not going to give us any adjustment to get toe out. So what we're going to do is we're going to cut about 10 mil or so off of here, so we've got that little bit more adjustment to toe it out that little bit more, so then we can play with caster, camber and all that stuff. That wouldn't have been an issue if we didn't have 2 bolt-on spacers, because we've got the bolt-on spacer here and bolt-on spacer here. It makes these even longer, so if we just had a slip-on here and the bolt-on here, we wouldn't have to cut it down, but the bolt-ons are a lot better. The slip-on, you have minimal amount of thread there, which can pull out of the rack and pull the threads out, so we'd rather keep the bolt-ons on and then just cut these down a little bit to give us enough adjustment. The blade's not the best for cutting, but we'll see how we go with it. So we start about there. I could have been a blade in that one.
Yes, that blade has added actually.
I'm going to hurt my hand doing that. I'll just clean up the thread a little bit. Make sure it still goes on. Doesn't want to go on. There we go. And that should give us enough adjustment to go all the way to the end now, whereas before it was stopping about here. Stops about there, which is pretty much perfect. So you got enough to screw on there with a couple of threads left. So we'll do that to both sides and see how it sits. Alright, I'm going to show you how to install caster arms correctly. So this one, I don't know who installed it, but it wasn't installed correctly. What happens is you can see how much thread you've got on this side and then how much thread you've got on this side here. And if you were to adjust that to say, bring it forward, you'd go this way, like that. And then this thread here is going to run out before that thread runs out there. So what you do to install them is, before you install them, max them out all the way in. So that one's all the way in, that one's all the way in, and then you start from there. So you adjust it out so that both threads are evenly coming out like that. And then if you install it like that, you can adjust it either way and you'll get maximum adjustment out of it. Whereas before, we would have adjusted it forward and then we would have stuck and we would have to take this off and redo it all again and install it like that. So if you're ever installing any adjustable arms, that's exactly how you want to do it. So now we've got everything in. It's all just loose at the moment, but we're going to chuck it onto the alignment machine and make sure everything's pointing somewhat straight. And then we're going to go over everything, tighten it all up, put split pins in everything and Loctite what needs to be Loctited. So front fitment's looking a lot better. It's got a bit more camber now. Had a very minimal amount of camber before, only had about 2 degrees. Now we're expecting a bit closer to 5, I reckon. 5, maybe even 6. It looks like a fair bit. I had to put some new coilovers in because these ones, I bought a second-hand set of ISCs for it probably about 6 months ago or so. Put them in and they started leaking. It was pissing out fluid. So we found some other second-hand ones, we chucked them in, put them in, and they were super low. And now we've got them to max height, and that's how high it is. Only just fit your hand in there. So hopefully that's enough. This side looks a lot higher. I think that's just the broken guard. But we'll measure it up and see where everything's at. GDR? Cool, that's pretty good. Not bad for an eye alignment. So we got 5.2 degrees of camber on the left, 5.5 on the right. Caster's way too much, 10 degrees aside, which we'll pull back. And toe was 4 mil toe out total. So camber's pretty much perfect what we wanted it at. And toe out on turns is pretty much 0. So that's on basically the 0 Ackerman setting, which we can adjust, and I'll probably show how to adjust in another video. But for this one, we've just got it on the 0 Ackerman setting. Now I'm going to put the car up in the air and start adjusting. So we're just lining the steering wheel up straight now, which looks like
That's actually pretty good.
lining up straight now. So when you do the alignment, the wheels point the way, then the steering wheel is nice and straight. Probably that way a little bit. Yeah, about there. Alright. So when aligning, you always start from the rear. The front reads off of the rear, so you need the rear to be relatively straight. And this isn't too bad from what we did last time, hasn't changed too much. Basically in a drift car, camber wise, you want anything from maybe 1 degree negative camber to about positive 0.5, depending on your setup and what sort of grip levels you want and whatnot. 0.5 positive, basically in a straight line, when it squats down, will make it sort of even out to 0 and have a nice contact patch on the back. But if you've got a little bit of negative camber, it can give you a little bit more side bite as well. Toe, basically you want either 0 to toe in. Toe out is pretty terrible for drifting. Toe in will give you a little bit more grip and make the car a little bit more snappy. So we're going to start with that. This has only got standard traction arms in, so we're not going to be playing with that. Basically just setting it up with toe and camber. So with rear adjustment on S and R chassis, there's a few different ways you can go about it, and it also depends if you have a Hicus or non-Hicus model. So this is a Hicus model. Any form of drifting or anything, you want to remove the Hicus, and there's a few ways you can do that. The most simple way is basically buying one of these Hicus lock bars, bolts into the original Hicus mounts here, and then basically you just bolt your stock arms back onto there, and then you've got your adjustment in here, and then it uses the same ball joint on the knuckle here, which is perfectly fine. The other way of doing it is to buy a Hicus removal kit, and it'll bolt a bracket onto here, and then it will use a normal toe arm here. Normal, I say normal, it's actually an aftermarket one. And then you have to remove this ball joint here and then put a bush in there so it goes through there like a normal one. That's a little bit more work. This is the more simpler way. And then the third option is to remove the subframe, take that out completely, and then put a non-Hicus one in, and then use your non-Hicus aftermarket arm. So that's your toe adjustment. On a non-Hicus one, even if you have a stock arm here, you have an eccentric bolt here, which you can adjust by, but that's very limited. With camber, also you have a stock eccentric bolt up here you can adjust with, even if you've just got the stock arm. But you can also install camber arms. These are just some cheap generic ones, I think, and then basically you just adjust through here, undo both locking bolts and adjust there. So we've got this set up now to a pretty basic setup. Just flattened out the camber and then gave it a little bit of toe in either side. Didn't want to go too crazy because this thing hasn't got a lot of power, and we've just changed everything in the front end, so we want to see how that feels first, and then we can go with a bit more aggressive setup in the rear. So we'll move on to the front now. So first thing we're going to do is move this caster back. 10 degrees is way too much caster. Generally you want anywhere between sort of 7 and 8 degrees. Camber's looking not too bad at about 5 degrees. Depending on how you want the car to drive, a little bit less camber will give you more grip in a straight line and more grip sort of flicking into the corner, but more camber will give you a little bit more grip while you're actually sideways and on lock. That's a very, very simple way of explaining it. But this only had about 2 degrees of camber before, so we wanted to get a little bit more, so we extended the control arms. Toe is out, that's just because the steering wheel's straight and the wheels are pointed on an angle, so we'll fix that up and make sure the rack's all centered up. But first thing I'm going to do is get this caster sorted. With these new knuckles, it looks like it brings the actual wheel and knuckle point back a little bit further than where the control arm is. So I think we're gonna have the wheel pretty far back in the well, so we might have to trim a bit off of this side skirt here. We've got plenty of room back to the actual car. It's just this side skirt's getting pretty close. Alright, so now we're at around 7.5 aside. We're going to get this toe a little bit closer. Obviously changing the caster has dramatically affected the toe. So we'll get that a bit closer and then see what everything else is like. A lot of the time changing one thing will change something else. As you can see, the camber's changed a little bit as well. And then changing the toe will change the camber a little bit, because this wheel's basically pointing in like that, which is going to have a different camber to when it's basically dead straight. As you can see now, we're giving it a little bit of toe out. The camber has gone down to 5. I think it was about 5.5 before. So we'll set it around there, and then we'll get the other side a bit closer. Oh, Jesus. So we're going to go around 16 mil total toe out, and that's giving us about 5 a side camber. 5 and 5.4 is not too bad. These aren't like S13s where you can adjust them by the top. You've got to adjust the actual arm, which is right up in there, which you probably can't see. Right up in there, which is really hard to adjust. So if it's within sort of 1/2 degree, it's not too bad. You're not going to notice that. So we'll look at locking everything off and then testing lock to lock to make sure clearance is alright, and then go from there. Alright, I'm going to start with locking off the caster arms. So a lot of people get this wrong massively. Basically what you want to do is you want to do this one up first onto that one there. So that's the one that you use to adjust it. You want to lock that to that. Some people do this one up to that, which isn't going to actually do anything because the thread goes into here. So you want to do that up first, which we'll do. Now you want them nice and tight so they don't come loose, but you don't want to massively over tighten them. And then what you do is you want to do this one up to the actual caster arm. So that, again, the thread goes into here, that locks that off, stops the thread from moving. And you got to watch, sometimes these are the opposite way to normal. See, this one's doing up, whereas that one was undoing to do up, I think. And now what you want to do is you hold the adjuster one to get this clevis or rose joint, whatever you want to call it, nice and straight. You don't want it cocked to the side like this. If you do it up without holding this one, see how it's cocked to the side there? When you're driving and it goes up and down, it's going to be maxing out here, and you're going to snap this bad boy here. So you want it to get it nice and straight like that, and then do it up at the back there. Nice and straight, so it's got room to move both sides. And locked off 7.5. Then repeat with the other side, and then you work your way down. So if we adjusted the camber, we would lock off the caster, then lock off the camber, and then lock off our toe, because each one slowly changes each other one. Alright, now something I always check after an alignment is clearance both ways. So to do that, we jack the car up, which isn't the same as when it's at ride height, but it's a good sort of guide. It's a lot harder to do it on ride height without actually driving the car in and out, which we do when we leave the workshop. But we're going to jack it up now. We've removed the brake lock and the steering lock. So what we'll do is we'll pull this one in, which it's already hitting on the skirt at the back here, which we're going to have to trim. I don't even know if we're going to be able to turn it without trimming that. Oh, almost broke it. There we go, in we go. Go up a bit higher. That's sitting on the coilover already. So that's why we check for clearance. Yeah, it's sitting up there, the coilover. Oh, it's hard to see on the camera. Right, that's the problem with our chassis suspension, is there's not much clearance on the trailing wheel. We'll check it the other way anyway. Let's watch that. Oh. And on this side should be a bit better. Oh, it's tight. Definitely gonna have to do some trimmage. There we go. And now that's hitting on the coilover again. So to fix that, we're either gonna have to put some lock stops in, which will limit this wheel over here. If we put a lock stop on the control arm to then hit on the knuckle here and stop it just before. Maybe stop it about there somewhere. Or we can put some bigger spacers on, which will move the wheel out further, and that'll give us a bit more clearance up there. So two options. We'll probably end up doing both, but we're going to be very limited on lock, if that's our limiting factor there. Still a lot more lock than it had before with these new bolt-on ones, but there's plenty more there to be had if we can get a bit more clearance out of it. So we've got it all aligned now. This is the lock we've got on our leading wheel, a fair bit more than before. And then other side, our trailing wheel. Being that 0 Ackerman knuckles, we've got a lot more lock on the trailing wheel as well. Now, our limiting factor, being an R chassis, is all the crap they put up in here, and the brake caliper is actually hitting on the upper arm. So it's a bit hard to see there, but if I straighten it out, it's basically this bit on the caliper here hitting on this upper arm here. So we're gonna have to put a lock stop in down here on the control arm to limit on the knuckle there, so that hits just before that hits. Well, that's going to be a job for another day, but got the prototype Costal knuckles in. Well, they're not actually prototype now because they've made a lot of other knuckles, but they were prototype years ago. And we've got our extended control arms, GK Tech caster arms, which aren't my caster arm of choice, but they just came in the car, so we're using them. Would much rather the Costal ones as they're nice and strong. And then we've got our caster arm brackets here, braced and braced across as well, so that'll be a lot stronger and should be a lot nicer to drive now. So next up, we've got to make the lock stops up. Basically, you've got to do that so that you limit the amount of lock you've got at a certain point before it starts hitting everything, because we don't have unlimited clearance, especially in an R chassis. You've got all this upper arms and coilover and whatnot in the way. So the limiting factor on this setup is actually the brake caliper is hitting on the upright here, as you can see on the other side here. It's a bit hard to see, but you might see it there. So what we're going to do is basically, we've got this bolt. It's a M10 bolt, I think, from Bunnings. And then you've got 2 nuts on it. So we're going to weld this nut here, which we've put a little spacer on, to the control arm. The reason we've got the spacer is so that on the control arm it sits flat like that, and we can still spin this nut here, which is locked off, like that. So that can spin and lock onto that nut there. So this is going to sit in there, something like that, on a bit better of an angle once I can get it in there. And it's going to hit on the actual knuckle there, and then we can adjust where it stops. So obviously when you spin it in or out, it's going to go like that, and we can put it in the perfect spot so that that limits the lock rather than the actual brake caliper hitting on the other side. So we'll get the right spot for that, and then we'll show you how it works. So that's what we've done here. As you can see, the end nut here is welded. I'm not going to touch it because that's really hot. And then that's just your locking nut there, which locks it onto there. And then we've done it basically in the middle of the thread here, so you've got adjustment either way. And then what we've done is basically adjusted this out while it's on the ground and it's got the weight of the car, because when it's in the air and the wheel is drooped down, it's different to when it's got the weight of the car on it. So you always do it with the weight of the car on, and you basically get it to the knuckle to hit this, adjust that out, and basically move this in or out until you get the position where you want, basically where you've got the most amount of lock on the other side before it's hitting. So we've basically got it to where it's hitting the caliper on that side, and then adjust this out a little bit. So we've got about 5-10mm clearance on that side, because you will have a bit of flex when it's under load. So yeah, that's how easy it is to make lock stops. I've never actually done it before, so it's good to actually do it. Might have to do it to my car now too. Just gonna have to see how these hold up, because it's obviously just a little small nut here, and it's gonna have a lot of load on it when you're chucking it to full lock. So might take a spare couple of these bolts to the track with us. And just another thing to note as well is you really want it to stop on the knuckle as well. You don't really want it to stop on anything like down here, because that'll have more load on it and you end up bending that, whereas the knuckle's nice and solid. So you want a nice solid bit of the steering to stop on there. But yeah, that's the end of the lock kit done. I'll spray that up black so it doesn't rust, and away it goes.